Okay, Enid, are you back and ready?
Yeah, we're good. See me.
Enid, are you back and ready?
Need a.
Yes, we're ready.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so very first question. Do you have any questions? That was easy, right? Does anybody have any questions over respiratory? Oh, I gave those to you weeks ago. So you're good there, right? All right, so my next question. What's the number one thing that you are learning to do as a nurse?
Assess. Or prioritize, yeah.
That's right. Your primary job as a registered nurse is to identify your patient's problems and help them fix them. So what do you suppose my questions would pertain to? Would be identifying your patient's problems and what you would do to fix them. So let's recap what that actually means. In order to identify a problem, you have to know what's not a problem. So one of the main things you have to know about all my material is what's normal. What does a healthy adult's body system function look like? And what are the primary organs that we're interested in you knowing what they do? That's why those A&P reviews are out there. For those of you who haven't had A&P, for those of you who have had it, you learn it on a much deeper level than you need to know as a nurse. So I simplified it. Go out and look at them. It'll help you. Secondly, if that is normal, everything outside that box is abnormal. Very simple concept, but it's one that most students struggle with for this whole first semester. So anything that doesn't match with normal is abnormal, period. Don't try to say, oh, but that's the patient's normal. No, that just confuses you. Say it's the patient's typical or routine, okay? And we recognize that because of chronic illnesses, somebody's routine or typical function may look a little bit abnormal, but it is still abnormal, okay?
So we're not likely to have questions about that will say, this is the client's typical.
No, we don't typically put that in there for fundamental students. If we want that, that information is already there for you in the STEM. That'll come probably in additional semesters, right? So basically, when you assess a patient, you're always comparing them against normal. And that's how you determine what's abnormal. But then when you determine what's abnormal, you have to know, what does that mean? What's the relevance? What's the significance of that? So with every one of my lectures, there are nursing problems that we've identified. Remember
Mr. Baird?
Yes?
Could you repeat the question you got in Stillwater? We couldn't hear the actual question.
Jaden.
Oh, the question that the student asked was,
Yes.
so does that mean my test questions will not include something that deals with the patient's typical or routine? And I said that is correct.
Okay.
That's not what we want you to compare it to as far as a fundamental student is concerned. All right, so basically with all our content, you need to know what those problems are and what each one of them has in common with each other or what they have not in common. You need to be able to distinguish between them. So, Tonkwall, what's the 3 nursing problems we identified for the respiratory system? Ineffective airway clearance. We called it compromised airway is what we called it this fall. Because remember, we don't use NANDA terms now. We have to make up our own. What's the other 2?
Altered loose snoring.
Very good. And what's the last one? That's right, very good. So basically, you need to be able to look at some patient information and determine which of those 3 or which 2 of those 3 occur. Remember, a breathing pattern problem or a compromised airway problem will always become an impaired gas exchange problem if we don't recognize it quickly enough. If the patient's body cannot compensate, it will always deteriorate to an impaired gas exchange problem. So once we have an impaired gas exchange problem, we have to look further to figure out, is this an airway issue or is this a breathing pattern issue? Because it helps determine what actions we take. If we have something lodged in somebody's airway and we want to give them Narcan or naloxone, we're not going to solve their gas exchange problem because that's not the nature of their problem. So recognize you've got to be able to identify those problems when you read that test stem and what does the difference between them. And then recognize that some actions pertain to all three problems and some only pertain to certain problems. But recognize what can you do as a nurse. Recognize there'll be independent actions and dependent actions. Enid, what's the difference?
Dependent, you have to have an order for. He can hear us.
He's asking us.
Okay, didn't let go.
Dependent, you have to have an order for.
Which one is the one you need a provider's order for?
Dependent.
Dependent. It depends on whether or not you have an order. So those are things like medications, tubes, anything that is going inside that patient's body, you need an order for. Okay? And that includes gases like oxygen. But we do have, remember, things we call standing orders. So you've learned about a couple of those this fall. And so make sure that you recognize when those can be implemented. Remember, a standing order can only be implemented when the patient's condition merits it, and by that we mean that the patient is symptomatic. Okay? All right, and then always recognize that once we do an action, we have to evaluate it. So we need to know what we can expect from our action. And then we need to see if it happened. Okay? And remember, the planning part of the nursing process is we're always trying to get them back to their highest level of functioning or to normal functioning, whichever may be possible for that patient. When we're talking about priority actions, remember you can delegate, but remember to use those 5 rights of delegation that we talked about to make sure that you're not delegating something that only a licensed nurse can do. So in each of my lectures, we talk a little bit about that, about what you can and cannot delegate. And then recognize that 2 priority actions for almost every problem out there are medication administration and patient teaching. So for each of the subjects, know what is within your privilege to teach and know what is a priority to teach for that particular patient and that particular problem. Make sure that that priority teaching includes medication information and the things that we've talked about are priorities there. Now, back to my original question. Do you have any questions? Okay, then I think we move on to, oh, we do have a question. Hold on, we have the first question of the day. Here we go. Please.
All right, for our standing orders, is there anything specific you want us to, I know that we've got a basis for a standing order. What is ours? Is that specifically referenced in our materials, what ours are based on this test? Is it just anybody who comes in with a below a 95 on our an O2, our standing order is to put them at 2 liters?
Okay, so that's a great question. Remember in simulation, there were patients who had O2 sats that had objective data. Objective data, is that a symptom or a sign? It's a sign. We had patients who had signs of hypoxemia. They were less than 95. Could we implement standing orders? No, because what was the principle we just talked about? They have to be symptomatic, which means they have to have what? Symptoms, not signs, symptoms. So they have to be in respiratory distress. They have to have a change in their color, a change in some other aspect of their perception of how they're breathing. Okay, so I'm feeling dizzy, I'm feeling lightheaded, I'm feeling like I can't catch my breath, I feel like somebody is squeezing the living daylights out of me and I can't take a deep breath. They have to have a symptom that coincides with that sign.
So if your patient is up chatting with their relative and they've got a 94 O2, you don't put oxygen on.
Absolutely, that doesn't qualify according to our principle of implement standing orders. Okay. Did you have something to add to it?
That could possibly be their typical.
That could be their typical,
COPD.
that would be an example. Yes, somebody who has a chronic respiratory condition that they need with that coverage. And so, even though that's an abnormal finding, they're not symptomatic. And so we don't have to miss any orders.
You review the delegation, you said five, something about five.
The vibrate.
The 5 rights of delegation, so in your boot camp material and in your fundamental text both, I believe you can list those, you can put the index. So, Sylvia, why don't you start us off? What are some of those 5 rights? Right person, right task, good.
Right time.
I don't think right time is that, that's still medication.
It's not right time, I like.
Right circumstances, good.
They have to be competent.
Okay, so that has to do kind of with the right person. Okay, so they have to have been trained. Enid and Topo, can you jump in and help us? What's the other 2 rights?
What have they said so far? Right task, right person, right. I don't remember what they said.
Person, task, and circumstance that it says so far.
I feel like it's right medication, but it's not the term like. They're drawing a blank in either.
Well, they're discussing, and that's progress. That's good.
They are discussing.
Topo, do you have any ideas?
No, the 5 rights
I think we're
of
talking about.
delegations.
I'd have to turn the Enid mic off so Topo can.
Okay, say it again.
Right direction and communication.
Very good. So sometimes you have to be very specific in what you're delegating because there's more than one option. Something might be interpreted differently if you don't make it clear.
Direction.
And then right supervision. Okay, so you still have some responsibility. Is that the 5th one? I'm trying to remember what that 5th one is too, but I think it is right supervision. That even though you pass a responsibility on as a registered nurse, you're still responsible for correlating the data to the patient's condition.
I have a question.
Okay, so if you delegate vital signs, for example, frequent vital signs post-operatively, it's still your responsibility to make sure that they're being done and then make sure that you're trending the patterns.
I think we have a question in Enid.
Okay, go ahead.
As far as standing orders go, like in our test questions, will it tell us if one of the answer options is to administer medication? Will it tell us that it is ordered? And if it doesn't tell us that it's ordered, does that, does that make
Okay.
sense?
All right, so let me clarify, let me answer your question 2 different ways. First off, medications, the only medications that you have standing orders for are oxygen and those that fall under the jurisdiction of ACLS, Advanced Cardiac Life Support. There are no other information out there, with one exception, and that would be perhaps the Narcan. So because of the opioid crisis, I think that naloxone is now considered a standing order for a lot of places. Okay, so medications on your test questions are not going to be standing orders unless they fit that description. You all are not ACLS trained, so I'm not going to give you an ACLS question. Okay, so that narrows it down to naloxone and oxygen. All right? Yes, Narcan or naloxone. Narcan is the trade name. Naloxone hydrochloride is the actual generic name. That's for an opioid or narcotic overdose. Somebody's taken too much. Okay? Now, did I answer that question? Or did I forget the other part of it?
No, that makes sense. I
I
just want,
think-
yeah.
Is the second part of it that as long as it's listed as an option, you can assume that you were able to give it, correct?
Right, yes.
Well, if it's not a medication, then recognize a properly worded question. Let me clarify
That's what
something
I'm
here.
gonna ask,
A
yeah.
properly worded question, when it comes to an NCLEX question, and there's a medication option, it's implied that you have the order for it.
Okay,
It's
yeah,
not a
that's what
standing order related question. That is the other part. Thank you for reminding me of that, Mrs. Hay.
You're welcome.
Okay?
And then action or imply that.
Because like with the hypothermia and the warm IV fluids, I didn't pick that one because it didn't say that it was ordered.
I'm sure that the school district, dependent on the answers.
No, because a properly worded question